Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the third and final chapter of the book of Zephaniah. We're going to open with the who, what, when, where, why formula. The who, Zephaniah, he's introduced in the opening verse of the first chapter as the son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amathiah, son of Hezekiah. This may or may not have been Hezekiah the king. So he was of royal blood, if that is true, and his vantage point reflects this. He has an interest and intense concern with the machinations of the geopolitical. He foretells, well, we'll get to the what. What he was a prophet. What he prophesied was the day of Yahweh, the destruction of many nations, and the restoration of Jerusalem. And he does that in those order in the three chapters of his book. Where or when he prophesied, or who, what, when. When he prophesied was in the reign of Josiah. Josiah was also a grandson of Hezekiah, so he was the royal heir. Zephaniah was a cousin. I believe Isaiah was also of royal blood, so they had an intimate familiarity with the court, but the placing of this suggested it was in the earlier part of Josiah's reign. Josiah reigned from 640 to 609 BM before Messiah. He was killed on the battlefield, and a pivotal event occurred in his reign. In 622, the writings of the law were rediscovered in the temple, and there was a great revival of that. But the conditions that he observes and reflects are reflective of the conditions before then. So before Josiah came along, his father Amnon was the king, and he was an idolater, and his father Manasseh was an idolater, but Hezekiah was a reformer. So that's the fluctuation of Judean kings. You know, there's some good ones and there's some bad ones. Josiah was one of the good ones, but he hadn't really come into his own yet. The where, he was a Judean, and he preached in Judea, but about other nations. So, that we're going to review them in our review. And why is because his audience needed to know this stuff. We have to be prepared. His audience is both immediate and his posterity, and we need to know these things which pertain to the day of Yahweh and the restoration of Israel in the last and final day. That's what we're going to cover today. So what took place in the second chapter, these destructions of nations foretold, have already occurred. But before he even gets into that, he says, "Seek Yahweh, all you meek ones of the earth, who have done his justice. Seek righteousness, seek meekness, if so, that you are hidden in the day of the wrath of Yahweh." So Zephaniah's name actually translates as Yahweh, hides or shields or protects. So he had the ingredients and the resources and the revelation to remain hidden from the wrath of Yahweh, because the day of Yahweh is alternately a day of doom and is also a day of blessing. Is it a day of salvation, but it is also a day of judgment. So the trick is to get on the other side of the judgment. The Canaanites, the Philistines, they were declared destroy, and sure enough they would, and Israel would inhabit their coast. Moab and Ammon, these were the two nations born of Abraham's nephew Lot, the incestuous liaison with his two daughters who got him drunk after his wife turned into a pillar of salt for looking back on Sodom. I have heard the reproach of Moab and the revilings of the children of Ammon, with which they have reproached my people, and have exalted themselves against their border. Therefore, as I live, declares Yahweh of hosts, the Elohim of Israel, Moab shall be like Sodom, and the children of Ammon like Gomorrah, a possession for weeds, and a pit of salt, and a waste forever. The remnant of my people plunder them, and the rest of my nation possess them. So their day is finished. It's already a declared fact. It hasn't come to pass yet, but it has come to pass since. These are historically accurate prophecies. Moab is no longer a nation. Ammon is no longer a nation. Israel is. And the restoration, which is spoken of in the third chapter, is something qualitatively more significant than the foundation of the modern state of Israel, whose origins can be traced to 1948. Verse 11, Yahweh shall be awesome to them, for he shall make all the mighty ones of the earth to shrivel. Let the coastlands of the nations bow down to him, each one from his place. So these coastland nations were Canaan and Philistine. The Philistines were Aegean pirate raiders who crept down. They were repelled by Ramses III. They initially tried to invade Egypt, but they were repelled by Ramses III, and they settled in Canaan, the land. They were one of the nations in the Israelites, but their day is numbered, and he shall stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria and make Nineveh a waste, as dry as a wilderness. So Assyria was one of the three world powers at the writing of this, but their king died in 627. One of their last powerful king. After that, they sort of declined and eventually would be swallowed, subsumed, conquered, and consolidated by the Babylonians, who so thoroughly destroyed their city that it would not be until the year 1845 AD that archaeologists actually uncovered some of the ruins and the remnants. So they totally did destroy it, and this is also predicted by one of Zephaniah's contemporaries, Nahum, who writes 150 years after Jonah of the impending destruction of that ancient epicenter of iniquity. So these nations are all gone. They had their hour. Israel is still with us, though. They do survive. This is the exultant city that is dwelling in safety, that said in her heart, I am in it, and there is none but me. How she has become a waste, a place for beasts to lay down. Everyone who passes by her whistles and shakes his fist. So this once ancient thriving metropolis is reduced to a place that the beast dwell and inhabit. And this came the place. It was completely wiped off the face of the earth, the map of the earth. It was no longer an inhabitable place. It was buried underground so thoroughly that it took until the 19th century for any, this city was legendary. It was a figure of legend until it was actually discovered. So this, he says, there is... she has become, so he's predicting in the future tense, even though it hasn't come to pass yet, but whatever Yahweh declares, that is established as fact, because his word is truth. 3rd chapter, 1st verse, book of Zephaniah, lesson itself. Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the oppressing city. So that oppressing, rebellious, and defiled city on whom woe is pronounced is none other than Jerusalem. They were supposed to be a covenant city of a covenant people. They had rebelled against the terms of that covenant. They had declared war against the lawmaker, and they were defiled by their pollution, their moral pollution, their covenant breaking, the society-wide endemic, and the oppression of their own. So they weren't a dominant nation, but there was certainly oppression in their midst. The rich were oppressing the poor, the landowners were oppressing the peasants, and injustice was not being enacted. Their justice system was one of injustice, where the wealthy could pay their bribes and the poor could go neglected. It was just a matter of course. So she was rebellious, defiled, and oppressive. She did not obey the voice. She did not accept instruction. She did not trust in Yahweh. She did not draw near to her Elohim. So even though they had access to all these things, the voice, the presence, the instruction as codified in the laws of Moses and in the writings of the prophets, and also the writings, the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, they did not benefit. They did not make the most of having these privileges. With privilege comes responsibility, and with freedom must be balanced. In order for a free people to remain free, they have to exercise that balance responsibly, and this Judah and Israel did not do. They did not obey the terms of the covenant. The covenantal curses were pronounced in the laws. The terms of the covenant, they would be uprooted if they did not obey the voice. And this went on for centuries, and finally Yahweh was long-suffering and he had enough. He uprooted them and displaced them because they did not obey the voice. They did not heed to the instructions, and they not seek him out in prayer or his presence or anything like that. Even though they had the temple, they were estranged from his presence. He was the secret to their success, but they didn't unlock it. And they had no one to blame because they had the instruction, they had the culture, they had the education, yet they went completely over their heads. They did not make the most of it. Her rulers in her midst are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. They shall leave no bone until morning. So the powers that be, the political and judicial and the wealthy landowners, they were likened to carnivorous predators, a lion on the hunt, a lion roaring. The adversary is described in that phrase in 1 Peter 5:8. That's when the mask and pretenses are removed. Elsewhere we read he disguised himself as an angel of light, but when the masks are removed, he is a roaring lion, and Satan's human minions reflect his nature, his character, his behaviors. And, the judges, these are the ones who had been entrusted to administer justice. Part of the terms of the covenant were principles of equitable jurisprudence, where there was to be no partiality, no bribes or anything like that, but human corruption got in the way, and human corruption compromised the implementation of efficient justice. And, they were all out for themselves. Whether they ruled, they sought to fleece the sheep they should have been shepherding, and they sought to rob the people whose justices they should have been amending. Her prophets are reckless, treacherous men. Her priests have profaned the temple. They have done violence to the law, the Torah. So in the secular society, the spiritual leaders were equally guilty, and these prophets were not the written prophets or even the spoken prophets. These are false prophets. There may be one or two known by name. I think there's one or a priest in the book of Amos who contest Amos's right to be prophets, but the prophets, there's usually a dichotomy and a clash between them and the priesthood, because the priests were derelict in their duties. They were the enforcers, upholders, upkeepers, and interpreters of the law. So the existence of prophets came because the institutional priesthood was corrupt and derelict in their duty. But they certainly, the religious and political establishment certainly employed false prophets. There was nothing new. Jeremiah, who was contemporaries with Zephaniah, writes of his encounters and their dreams and visions and just their conspiracies to kill them. So they were a very real presence at the time that he is writing this. Yahweh is righteous in her midst. He does no unrighteousness. Morning by morning he brings his justice to light. It had not been lacking, yet the unrighteous one knows no shame. So even though Yahweh is an intrinsically righteous being and he is the king and sovereign, theoretically, the people have become rebels and they become their own rulers. They had usurped the authority and power in what should have been a perfect theocracy under his rule, and they knew no shame. They knew that they were represented and delegated and entrusted to represent this one as the people in entrusted positions in his covenant nation. Yet they had no shame in fleecing the people or ripping them off or exploiting them or oppressing them. And this was done in the name of Yahweh, in whom no unrighteousness dwells. No sin unconfessed of can even enter into his presence he cannot look at sin with any degree of allowance. But his justice is not compromised. He sees all, he knows all, and the purveyors of injustice are going to they're going to taste his vengeance on the day of Yahweh, which awaits us all. And we want to stay on the side of the fence, on which side the day of Yahweh is a day of salvation. That's what we want to do. I have cut off nations, their corner towers are in ruins. I have made their streets deserted, with no one passing by. Their cities are destroyed, without man, without inhabitant. So some of these nations, we referenced every one that was referenced in the second chapter. All of these nations had in common, they were once resplendent and they were reduced to ashes. Their historical memory preserved only in history books and archives and records. But these nations that one existed, they exhausted their window of grace, and their iniquities screamed to the heaven. Pride brought down a lot of these. That was the compelling factor for Assyria and Moab and Ammon, at least, mentioned. And once they are destroyed, you cannot rebuild once he destroys. This message is communicated somewhere else in Scripture, but they are ghost lands. They are uninhabited. They are desert wastelands. They are the natural. They are not civil. They are uncivilized areas that have once hosted flourishing civilizations, but are no more. I have said, only fear me, accept instruction, and her dwelling would not be cut off, all that I have appointed for her. But they rose up early, they corrupted all their deeds. So he's talking about Israel, because they had access to her instruction. These pagan Gentile nations that were destroyed did not have the benefit of special revelation. They did not have a law. They did not have prophecy, authentic prophecy anyway. They certainly had their version of prophets, and they did not have the worship and relationship or the knowledge of me, the capital Me, Yahweh on high. And but they violated the terms of the covenant. They were given explicit warnings and consequences for covenantal violations and obedience and rebellion, and they had reaped the whirlwind. What happened to these nations would happen to them. So I think the nation of Assyria was destroyed in 612 BM. Egypt was conquered by Babylon in 598, and Judah was not much longer, 586. Therefore wait for me, declares Yahweh, until the day I rise up for plunder. For my judgment is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them my rage, all my burning wrath. For by the fire of my jealousy all the earth has been consumed. So the day of Yahweh is described in the 15th verse of the first chapter by the author himself as a day of distress and trouble, a day of waste and ruin, a day of darkness and gloominess, and a day of clouds, dense clouds. So nothing pleasant to look forward to if you are on the receiving end of his wrath and his rage. So he's going to pour out his wrath on all the inhabitants of the earth, and he's going to spare those who he will have wrath on whom he has wrath and mercy on whom he has mercies. But there are certain definite conditions that we need to meet and satisfy if we want to be on the receiving end of his mercy and not experience the burning pains that our less fortunate neighbors will have. So gather all the nations, all the kingdoms, and all of them are going to be poured out. He's going to pour out his wrath like a vial of wine in the book of Revelation. For then I shall turn unto peoples a clean lip, so that they all call on the name of Yahweh, to serve him with one shoulder. So this clean lip is alternately translated as a pure language, and the language is not... the purity of the language is not necessarily any language in particular. It may not be Hebrew, it may not be Greek, but the one language they're going to have, Zephaniah also writes of this in 14:9, but they're going to have pure language. So no matter what language you have, you should not you resort to or use profanity, vulgarity, or any off-color language, really. You have to keep your speech pure, because what comes out of your lips is a reflection and manifestation of what dwells in your heart. Our true sentiments are reflected by the words that we speak. So that's the incentive for us, and we will call on the name of Yahweh. We should do that not trivially. To do that is blasphemous, but to treat it with all due reverence is what we owe him, and serve him and worship him is alternately translated. So all these people are going to be gathered to worship, and those who any element of iniquity in our lips. What did Isaiah say when he was confronted with the theophanic manifestation? Woe unto me, I'm a man of unclean lips. But all will be pured and at that great and glorious day. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offerings. So Cush was located and roughly corresponding to modern Sudan. It was the extreme end of the earth as far as the ancient Israelites were concerned. But even beyond that, if there were any Jews that had made their way down there, they were going to be gathered. And of course, this can be interpreted Christianly. So we exist in nearly every country of the earth. It is illegal to be Christian in a lot of countries, but we do have a presence, I think, in just about every country. But the dispersion and the diaspora are Jewish concepts. They were once a nation, and then the age of Gentiles kind of scattered them, and they ceased to be a consolidated nation, and they went into the earth and lost their national identity, but preserved their religious identity. In spite of many violent, systematic, and genocidal challenges, they have survived in spite of these. In that day you shall not be put to shame for any of your deeds in which you have transgressed against me. For then I shall remove from your midst your proud exalting ones, and you shall no more be haughty in my sacred mountain. So those who are on the receiving end of the salvation are saved in spite of their sins, but on that day they have the assurance of his forgiveness. As far as the east is from the west, he's going to remove it from it, in the words of the prophet Micah, and he's speaking about the same thing, the forgiveness unto justification, and the proud people. Pride is the sin which leads to every other sin. Had Lucifer never succumbed to pride, there might not be sin, at least as we know it, or at least as its origins we know it, would not be what it was if he did not succumb to the sin of pride. And they're going to be eliminated, and because the proud ones aren't going to be there, there's going to be no reason or reflection of their spirit or ethos for any of us who are forgiven and are humbled as the result of the experience of being forgiven. All pride and joy, all pride that we have in there will be subsumed by an awareness that we did not do this ourselves. We are the recipients of a gift. But I shall leave in your midst an oppressed and poor people, and they shall trust in the name of Yahweh. So poverty or affluence, the impoverished or the affluent, does not determine the quality of the worshiper. The poor, in spite of the affluent and the poor, both have temptations to sin that the middle class do not. Agar, the author of the 30th Proverbs, speaks of this when he writes, give me neither wealth nor poverty, lest I should steal, or lest I forget you and curse thy name. So the poor people are going to be oppressed, and but they're going to trust, and they're going to be see-through. They're going to persevere beyond and to the end of their oppression and persecution and their poverty, in the strength and the power and in the hope and the saving power of the name of Yahweh. The remnant of Israel shall do no unrighteousness, and speak no falsehood, nor is a tongue of deceit found in their mouth. For they shall feed their flocks and lie down, with none to frighten them. So this is a pretty promising promise, but it is a remnant. The concept of the remnant is prolific in the Jewish prophecies. It is also alive in the 5th chapter of Genesis. The righteous remnant passed from Seth's line all the way to Noah in that chapter. So it's just the concept of a righteous minority. When the majority of the world is wicked and astray, there is always a remnant, and only the remnant shall be saved. So the remnant is the righteous remnant, but the remnant have done unrighteousness, but they are not defined by it. But in this blessed future occasion, they will do no unrighteousness. They will not lie. They will not have it in them, and will not. They're going to have an abundance to feed their flocks and themselves, and they're not going to have any cause for fear or worry or dread or anxiety in this exalted expectation. Shout for joy, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. So this is a natural, expected reaction to live in Zion restored, in Israel restored, and once more the restoration that he speaks of is qualitatively and spiritually more significant than the reestablishment of Israel as a nation in 1948. So on this day, Israel is going to be the remnant. We are Israel. The church is likened to the new Israel, and many Jews are going to come to a saving faith in Yahshua in the final times. But that's when we're going to rejoice with all our hearts and shout for joy, and just shout and be glad and rejoice with all our hearts. Yahweh has turned aside your judgments. He has faced your enemy. The King of Israel, Yahweh, is in your midst. No longer need you fear evil. So with a powerful ally on our side like that, he is an omnipotent being. That means there's no limitation to his strength, or he has infinite or unlimited strength, and he forgives us. He turns aside our judgment. We deserve judgment, but he gives us mercy because we have met the criteria. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Matthew in the Beatitudes, and 5th chapter. And he has conquered and overwhelmed. He is an omnipotent being. There is no enemy, circumstance, or situation which he cannot overcome. And he is the rightful king, and when he is the king in the rightful place in the throne of his hearts, and also on the right, the Son is going to be the king of Israel. The king of the Jews is going to return with a sword in hand, and he's going to be in our midst, and there will be no evil, sin, or sorrow on the earth in his righteous rule, or at least in the New Jerusalem, which comes after that. And that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, do not fear, Zion, do not let your hand be weak. Yahweh your Elohim is in your midst, is mighty to save. He rejoices over you with joy. He is silent in his love. He rejoices over you with singing. So there's no reason to be afraid when we have him in our midst, when we have access to his presence, we have access to his power, and there is the fear of Yahweh is the fear which eliminates and expels all other fears, because when we fear him, then we have the assurance of that he is mighty to save. He will save us if we come to him meek and humble and contrite, and as we will rejoice in the same manner that he rejoices over us, which is with joy. Shout for joy, the 14th verse. And so as he rejoices in our restoration, so too must we rejoice in him who accomplishes our restoration. I shall gather those who grieve about the appointed place, who are among you, to whom its reproach is a burden. So the outcasts, the ones who are spit on, despised, ridiculed, and rejected, and outside of the parameters of societal acceptance will be there at that day, and he's going to gather them all at once. The oppressed, he intimately is invested in the welfare of the oppressed on the earth, and the burden is going to be alleviated. Come unto me, all ye who are heavy laden with burdens, and for my burden is light, and my rest is my yoke is not heavy. See, I am dealing with all those afflicting you at that time, and I shall save the lame, and gather those who are cast out, and I shall give them a praise for the name in the earth, where they were put to shame. So this is actually unusual language for Zephaniah. He is not intimately familiar. Remember, he is of royal pedigree or stock, so he does not really reflect the concern. The social justice prophecy is completely absent prior to this point, but he does reflect and repeat the fact that Yahweh's concern is for the lame, the handicapped, the crippled, the outcast, the ones the whole world has given up on, the outcast, the reject, the despised, the weak, the foolish. These are all paradoxically valuable in his kingdom, in his estimation. And, he's going to inflict vengeance on those who oppress the oppressed people. At that time I shall bring you in, even at the time I gather you, for I shall give you a name, and for a praise among all the people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, said Yahweh. So this is a reversal of fortunes. Those who are captive are going to be restored. The captivity was an event not far away. So in 586, they would cease to be an independent sovereignty. He is writing somewhere before the year 622 in the reign of Josiah, but what he speaks of is a future day. The captivity will be fully and finally reversed. It's not the restoration under Zerubbabel and Ezra and the Edict of Cyrus. This is the day of Yahweh when they are all gathered as one, and they will have a name. They will be saved, and the only name by which we can be saved is Yahshua Messiah, Acts 4:12. So we will have his name and his praise among all the people of the earth. And our captivity, our bondage, whatever pain, ailment, or oppression or affliction we endured on earth will be fully, finally, completely, and totally reversed, and all rights will be wronged, and we will know peace. So I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.